afternoon, good morning. Welcome to Better Place, Talking International Law with me, Jonathan Coley, Senior Lecturer at RMIT University, coming to you from Melbourne, Australia. Wherever you are on our beautiful planet, thank you for joining us. We hope you're all safe and well. In this episode of Better Place, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Maha Abdallah to the Better Place conversation to talk a little international law and human rights with us. Hello, Maha.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for hosting me.
Where are you tuning in from?
I am currently in Jerusalem.
Awesome. Maha is a human rights practitioner and advocate. And she's currently very engaged on researching and advocating on business and human rights issues, in particular in conflict-affected areas, including how we go about holding large multinational companies accountable for their involvement in human rights abuses. Full confession, Maha and I crossed paths in Geneva in late 2019, actually at the United Nations Annual Forum on Business and Human Rights. One of the reasons Maha was there was to pick up an award, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that is true. I mean, on behalf of the organization that I used to work at, Al-Haq, the Palestinian Human Rights Organization. Yeah.
And hopefully we can circle back around and you can tell us a little bit about Al-Haq and that well-deserved award that you received. But before we get stuck in, if I may, a little bit more of a formal introduction. Maha, you have an amazing CV and you do incredible human rights work. So I just wanted to give the audience a bit more of a formal taste of who you are. Maha Abdallah is an international advocacy officer at the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, formerly a senior legal researcher at Al-Haq, focusing on business and human rights and corporate accountability in occupied territory and conflict-affected settings. Primarily, she was focused on the role of corporations in the unlawful exploitation of natural resources, complicity and involvement in human rights abuses. She was elected to the ESCR-Net, into the International Network for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. She was elected to the ESCR-Net board in 2018 and serves on the project advisory group of ESCR-Net's corporate capture project and on the conflict and ESCR advisory group. She received her Masters of Laws from the Irish Centre for Human Rights and her BA in Political Science from the American University in Cairo. What did I miss, Maha? I mean, plenty, but anything in particular I missed?
I think this is quite comprehensive, I would say. We can go into some of the details later on during our conversation.
Brilliant. And as I always say, my obligatory follow-up question after such a stellar CV is, what's your favorite ice cream flavor?
That's a tough question.
We can't continue.
Chocolate.
Chocolate, okay.
Yeah, plain.
Okay.
Plain chocolate, yeah.
Don't get down, that's cool, that's a classic.
I wasn't expecting this question, but sure.
And I'm just curious, so many folks around the world are living under restrictions because of coronavirus, even lockdown. And many of us are taking up hobbies or getting distracted. Have you taken up any coronavirus hobbies in the past few months?
Certainly. I have gardening and planting. I think it's the first time I ever do it, and I got a bit obsessed with it. But I'm finding a lot of peace and therapy in gardening. Although we do live in an apartment, but we have some large windows and a balcony, so I'm able to practice that hobby. And you know, the nursery at home is growing and growing each month.
Are you growing? Beautiful. You growing vegetables or flowers or?
Mostly flowers, but some herbs also, you know, like mint, basil, rosemary.
The essentials like for a good Middle Eastern cook.
Exactly.
Oh, that sounds great. We have pesky possums here, so every time I plant my herbs, they get eaten.
Yeah. That's
Anyway.
unfortunate.
It is. Now, Maha, on to more serious stuff, perhaps. Better Place is a series we interview international law practitioners, people that do international law. I certainly consider you an international law practitioner. I'm wondering, does that label sit well with you? Is that how do you describe sort of your professional pursuit?
So I'm not really a big fan of labels generally, and that's something that is well known about me, especially among my small social circle and friends, that I try to avoid labels as much as possible because I don't like to categorize myself or people within a certain box or, limitations. But I think what I would usually use is a human rights advocate. I feel like that brings in more dimensions of what it takes to work for human rights, towards realizing human rights and advocate for them. But definitely a major and integral part of my work is international law and trying to understand but also bridge the theory to practice and then to influence the life and to realize a change on the ground for people and regardless of where they are.
Mm. And so much of your professional focus, you said you're tuning in from Jerusalem, so much of your professional focus has been on the pursuit of Palestinian rights. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. I think this is where my interest and my passion for human rights and for advocacy, social justice, and so on. This is where it all started, just from by virtue of who I am, where I'm from, what I've witnessed, what I've seen growing up, and so on.
So, uh, well, I don't want any assumptions made. So, can we unpack that a little bit? Who are you? What did you see growing up? Or all those things you just said. I guess well, I think I'm curious to know, and so's the audience. But yeah, what drives you? What led you to this career to become a human rights advocate?
Mm. I think a major influence to where I am today is my identity, the fact that I am a Palestinian woman who has lived in Jerusalem almost my entire life, besides my academic years in Egypt and then in Ireland. And I think that has shaped a lot my academic interests, but also my professional pursuit in the field of human rights. And I mean, the situation in Palestine is probably quite known for many around the world, but it is a situation of a prolonged occupation. It's not only about territorial disputes and conquering land and territory and resources, but it is about people and people's lives. And it has had a lot of impact, obviously, not only on my life, but on the lives of millions of Palestinians and others who live in this area in Palestine. And I think that's why I decided at one point, or I was inspired at one point, that there are tools and there are ways that we could make the situation better, and we could resolve things hopefully one day within a standard or within a framework that would guarantee everyone their rights and their ability to live in dignity, peace, and in a safe environment, and so on. So I think that's why I eventually chose this career. It was never deliberate. I never, it was never that I woke up one day and I was like, I'm going to become a human rights advocate. I think as a child, I always liked to write. I always liked to express myself in writing. And it was between journalism, political science, or human rights. And I never, as a kid, didn't really understand the difference between all these three. So when I got to university, I thought that political science might be, the way into opening this world.
Yeah, and journalism, political science, and law or human rights. I mean, it seems to me that so many of your job descriptions sort of allow the merger of all three disciplines and skill sets involved.
Certainly.
So I know you said that you didn't wake up one day and the career sort of was, you saw the vision, but was there a moment, like, can you think back, what put you on this path? Was there a
Mm.
particular morning where you woke up and said, screw it, I'm focusing on this?
I don't remember that particular moment, to be honest, but I do remember that at one point in my undergrad years, where I was more focused on maybe looking into being involved in the diplomatic sphere rather than the human rights and international law sphere. But eventually, I think I realized the limitations of working solely in a political context, and as ideal as it may sound, I think I thought that taking the internet, like purely the international law framework and the human rights framework, would be more beneficial, and it would allow me the freedom to genuinely express what I believe in, but also what is really happening on the ground.
Yeah.
Mm.
And make a difference on the ground too. Because that's
Hopefully.
certainly what I know about you, Maha. You're all about the practical impact. I'm
Which is
curious.
hard to
Oh, sorry.
see. Yeah.
I'm curious, if I may, though, go back. So you were born in Jerusalem, you raised in Jerusalem, proud Palestinian. You went to Cairo for your BA. I was just wondering what led you there, and then even perhaps more curiously, all the way to Ireland to get your LL.M, your Masters of Laws. So, what led you on that international route for your higher education?
I think I've always wanted to study abroad. I always knew that I would not be in Palestine to study, not because we don't have great universities. We do have very prestigious and progressive universities here in different fields. But I've always been keen on traveling, meeting new people, having different experiences, learning about new cultures, languages, ideals, and so on. So, and I got an opportunity after my high school to get a scholarship to study to do my BA in at the American University in Cairo. I thought that that would be a great place to start. It's very the multicultural place with foreign students coming from all over to
Mm,
study Arabic, to study about the Middle East, to study
mm,
Egyptology, and all of these things. So I found it to be a fascinating place. Also, one other reason why I was particularly keen on being in Egypt is I thought that it would be a good way to also connect to the rest of the Arab world. That's something that we're often so isolated from living in Palestine, because although we live, very close to Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Sudan, but we're unable to do these visits because of the different political restrictions that have been imposed and the divisions in the Arab world and so on. And it was indeed a great time where I was able to create amazing friendships with many Arab students who have turned into family, some of them, and who I'm still in contact with. So I feel like my Arab identity was also benefiting a lot at the time.
yeah. That's really interesting. And so many folks that I have spoken that have got human rights or international law careers have had that early on in life, that international travel
Mm-hmm.
and those international experiences. I think there is something to that. Um, but then you returned home to Palestine, and I believe you joined straight after your LL.M. You went and joined Al-Haq. Is that right?
So after I finished my undergrad in Egypt, I stayed there for 6 to 7 months, and I did an internship as a legal advisor at an organization called the Africa and Middle East Refugee Assistance, AMERA. And it was focused on providing legal advice and assistance to refugees coming from Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, in some cases Iraq and Syria, and tell them like how to maneuver the UNHCR system, how we could supporting them in their cases and so on. And that was also very like a turning point as well in my life, where I realized that this is something that I would really like to do.
Yeah.
I want to help people. If I have language skills or some legal skills or some research skills that could be beneficial for people, that's certainly something that I would like to do. So I was there until July or August 2013, and then I came back home to Palestine because of all the political also unrest in Egypt at the time. So I had to depart the internship a month or two early. And I joined the Al-Haq Legal Research and Advocacy Department initially as an intern as well.
And you've worked your
And
way up, huh?
yeah, and that's where I learned a lot about first Palestine, but also about international law, about how theory becomes practice. And, I developed all these skills in legal research and writing, for submissions, for reports, and so on. And then luckily it was like I was lucky enough that the organization also wanted me to stay on, and I stayed on initially as a research assistant and then as a legal researcher. And then
Yeah.
I went to Ireland after 3 years of practical experience with
Uh,
AlHaq to the Irish Center for Human Rights to do my LL.M in
yeah.
international human rights law.
And then came back to Al-Haq.
Yes, and then
And
I returned back to AlHaq. Yeah.
and where you helped lead the research and advocacy, in particular around business and business and human rights under occupation. So I'm curious. So Al-Haq means the law. I think if
Mm-hmm.
I've got the translation correct. So very prominent human rights organization that deals in, though, one of the most, well, let's call it politically sensitive, one of the most intractable, protracted, enduring conflicts, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Is there much appetite for a human rights conversation on either side?
Mm. Let me go back a bit. So al-haq means the right. So,
Okay.
the right to, or the right in general. But going back to your question, I think the, the situation, like the reality is not very encouraging for anything, to be honest. It's a dire reality. It's very gloomy, and it keeps getting gloomier and gloomier over the years. And that's something that has put people's hopes down, that has created a lot of frustration and a lot of feeling that nothing will really change the reality, and that's not a great place to be at, especially when you have such a young population as well amongst Palestinians. 60 or 70% are youth, but the situation or the environment is deliberately being made more difficult, coercive, encouraging them either to leave or assimilate in a certain context or reality. So, is there much conversation and space for human rights?
Yeah.
Always. I think Palestinians, and especially those in the human rights field and working in human rights organizations, do genuinely have big hopes and high expectations from international law. And me personally, I might have mentioned this earlier, but I do see international law as being one of the main tools that will result in a just solution or resolution on the long term. But it has to be depoliticized, and it has to be really taken advantage. It's a great framework. It's not perfect, but it's a great framework that should be applied in order to, make sure that people have access to their basic rights. People are able to exercise their freedoms, and their rights are genuinely guaranteed. So there's always space for human rights and international law in the society that I grew up with. That's for sure.
And wow, so there's so many ways I want to take the conversation, Maha. But let me ask you though. So you have these wonderful hopes and expectations for the role of international law in resolving and addressing the conflict and the lack of rights of Palestinians. But how is that married up to the reality, I guess? I'm curious, on a daily basis, I presume Al-Haq would have, and you yourself would have been presented many challenges to quite literally just even have a human rights conversation. Could you describe a few of those sort of more practical daily challenges that you guys confronted?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I haven't worked as much in the field as my other colleagues have. In the field, meaning like going to the field, speaking to persons affected, let's say by house demolitions, by killings of their loved ones or family members, by land confiscation, and the violations are a lot and many, unfortunately. But at the same time, I have been exposed to the field and to people that have been directly affected by these, and me myself have been at one point in life. So, and I know that there is always the question, like, what would a human rights organization do to me, especially if you're not providing any services or financial compensation, you're not a humanitarian agency. So if the house is demolished, for example, you're not there to give a tent or to give shelter or to give food or water or an alternative. You're there to document, and you're there to monitor the situation, the series of events that have led up to this, and so on. And it's hard for people not to question you and tell you, like, why are you doing, especially if they, for somebody who had just lost their home or their land, or a person that they care about. It's really hard to believe in a justice system that will not, bring you anything in the short run, not even in the medium run. But we still hope that it would do it in the longer run. And that's why, it's important for any human rights organization operating here. You hear a lot coming from them about the importance of accountability, the importance of justice, because that's something that people are also hanging on a lot in Palestine.
And so after those challenges of collecting the data and doing the research, I'm curious about that next phase of your role, which was the advocacy role, right? So you research, you write the reports, you collect the facts, collect the data, but then you present it and you advocate. And I presume there are, I mean, I don't want to presume, I'd love to hear sort of, what is that advocacy side of your human rights practitioner role sort of look like? Do you sit down with the Palestinian Authority? Do you sit down with Israeli authorities? And are they receptive to the reports that have been produced and the concerns raised?
I mean, as you mentioned, like after colleagues who are experts collect the data from the field, my role was more in the field of analyzing this data and looking at it from what violations does this data constitute under international law, whether human rights law, humanitarian law, and who are the perpetrators, who are responsible, who are the persons affected or victims in this case. If there's a trend, a policy, a systemic way of seeing this specific violation or a list of violations and so on. And that would be developed either in the format of long reports or shorter briefs or other type of publications. And yes, again, as you mentioned, this part of it was also to bring this to concerned parties and stakeholders that may and technically would have an influence to change it or to pressure the specific authorities to stop using like a certain policy or a certain practice against Palestinians and so on. And like in my previous role at Al-Haq, I never, like as an organization, we never had any direct engagement or advocacy with the Israeli authorities, mainly because it's something that is probably going to not yield into anything. And as an organization that has been deliberately targeted by the Israeli authorities over the past few decades, like since its existence actually, and the smear campaigns, the attacks against the organization and its staff, it's not an ideal situation. At one point in its life, Al-Haq used to take cases to the Israeli courts, but it stopped because as it was an organizational decision that it's not achieving anything, and the culture of impunity is the same. And we're just as an organization, the organization was just contributing to an unjust system that is legitimizing what is already illegitimate. So there's never been direct advocacy with the Israeli authorities as occupying power or as anything else. But at the same time, a lot of the advocacy that I was involved in targeted international audience and the international community, whether it be diplomatic missions that are based here or diplomatic missions that are in Geneva, the UN system, certain bodies and mechanisms at the European Union or capital levels, and some advocacy at a US level. But I mean, again, I worked at a local organization, although it would be considered big, but given the thematic issues and stuff that we cover, we were still restrained on human resources. So ideally, we would be everywhere in the world, in Latin America, Africa, the US, and so on. But it's just, it was impossible. But and I mean, also, I mean, besides advocacy with policymakers and diplomats and so on, it's always been important to also connect with networks, with practitioners in the field who are working on other similar situations, and other human rights organizations and social justice groups all over the world.
So I'm curious, I mean, it's obviously there's a lot of depressing news that comes out of the Middle East, and even what you just described sounds like a challenge, a challenging operating environment, shall we say, for a human rights organization. So is there any sort of success that stands out in your mind, sort of like big or small, sort of like a human rights advocacy success story that you can sort of, in those times of darkness, sort of hang your hat on and remember, hey, we did that, we could do it again?
To be honest, it's really, really not only difficult, it's unreasonable to talk about success in the context that we're operating with. Because, as long as there continues to be an occupation, as long as there continues to be a system that, of an institutionalized racism and discrimination against a certain group and people, and as long as the militarization and the dehumanization of people here, particularly Palestinians, continues, it's really, really hard for me as Maha, the Palestinian living in Jerusalem, to speak about successes, even if it's, technical. There has been some technical successes. But again, yes, and I think in the advocacy work that I have been involved in at the UN in Geneva, for example, there has been certainly some moments where I felt like my work and the organization's work is going somewhere and it's affecting people and policymakers to adopt certain resolutions or certain recommendations in their let's say in the Universal Periodic Review of the State of Israel, or in their in the Human Rights Council and so on. So there has been points like that, and that has been certainly points that gave me, but also my colleagues, then a lot of renewed energy, let's say, for sure.
I think those are important. I totally acknowledge and want to validate what you were saying before about the situation over there. But I think as human beings, as individuals that are sometimes feeling like banging heads against walls is what we do. It's important to also have those small successes. So well done. Speaking of successes, I wanted to mention your work at the UN, and in particular the award that you received, and perhaps an opportunity for you to talk about the work that you do in terms of business respecting human rights and international humanitarian law, the laws of war. Because you mentioned before, in terms of advocacy, you mentioned the UN, you mentioned countries, you mentioned militaries, you didn't mention businesses. And so, but that is actually now a huge focus of your work, to actually encourage businesses to become more compliant with international human rights. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And the more I delve into this specific area of focus, the more I realize how much the private sector owes to the people as well, and how we should be pursuing the private sector as much as we do with states, because unfortunately, the reality is that they are contributing and they are involved in human rights abuses and violations of international law everywhere. So
can you give us? Sorry, Maha. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
I was just. Can you give us an example, like a real life case study? You can either mention the name or not, but a real life sort of scenario of what you're talking about in terms of business and human rights abuses.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, my focus of research on this specific topic has, focused on the occupied Palestinian territory and how business enterprises have been involved in protracting the occupation and kind of allowing it to prosper and to be profitable and to to continue to violate certain rights. And I mean, it varies. Like some companies would be involved in maintaining some sort of a security apparatus by providing equipment, tools, surveillance equipment, and so on, and technologies as well. But then you look at other companies that are more involved in the unlawful exploitation of natural resources like water, land, stone reserves, and other resources like the ones we would have in the Dead Sea, for example. So there's really plenty of ways that companies can and have been involved in numerous violations of international law, some of them that amount to war crimes and grave breaches of international law, given the context of occupation that we have here. I mean, other examples would include the involvement of certain companies in providing equipment and tools to carry out home demolitions, and therefore the displacement and forcible transfer of some communities and populations. So, I mean, there's like plenty of case studies to look at, and there's been a lot that has been written about this issue, like specifically looking at the occupied Palestinian territory. But unfortunately, the problem is that we see companies continuously evading their responsibility and their liability.
So I was going to ask, have you confronted, have you put these facts and your legal analysis before companies, and what has their response been?
Yeah, definitely. We have done it, previously as part of my work with Al-Haq. We have communicated with specific companies to tell them, listen, you're operating, for example, in an illegal settlement, and settlements are illegal under international law for one, two, three, four reasons. This is what happens when you, as a private entity, you're contributing to this or you're involved in this, because there's also different levels of involvement that varies between, you know, direct or indirect involvement, complicity in the violation as well, or not. So it really varies, and you have to be like meticulous about what each company is doing. You can't put every company, all companies in one box of, being complicit in all violations. But yeah, so that has been done, and several times at least in my time, and I believe that it continues to date with Al-Haq. And the responses have always been, unfortunately, not satisfying, and there has always been ways that justify the company's behavior or the company's operations in occupied territory, although we have provided not only facts but also evidence that like to what they are contributing to or to what they are involved.
Mm.
And it's often hiding behind the military orders that are issued by the Israeli civil administration, which runs the occupied sorry, Palestinian territory, or it hides behind policies and practices that have long been used by the occupying power
Mm.
here. So for the company, it's something that has been, we can say, normalized.
So what do we need, Maha? So I mean, if we take your analysis at face value, we take the company's responses as essentially a shrug of the shoulders, thanks but no thanks. What's the missing link? What do we need? It sounds like some more robust accountability mechanisms, and did you have any in mind? It doesn't sound like there's any joy through the Israeli court system. So where would the accountability be found?
I, I definitely, I mean, accountability within the Israeli judicial system is something that is really uh, it's a system that hasn't been created to grant justice for Palestinians. This is as simply as I would summarize it with. But I'm sure there are experts in this field that could talk about this more eloquently than I would. So, let alone for justice or accountability for violations that are being committed by businesses and private actors in the occupied territory, which eventually are benefiting the occupying power and all of its work and tools and projects here. So I think looking at the international arena and what the international law could provide us, I think that's something that I would immediately look at when I look at the situation in Palestine from that angle. I would look at universal jurisdiction, for example, and being able to hold companies accountable in other countries where possible. I would look at when we're talking about multinational corporations as well, especially. I would look at their home states and how much the local legislations and regulations are compatible in a way with international law, but in a way to protect victims of violations of these companies. And I think with the work that's being done globally around national action plans of each country and each state, that's something that, although it's not the most binding or most
Yeah,
strict of
yeah,
mechanisms, but I mean, we
it's
can
something.
see a bit of, yeah, it's a basis for something bigger. And I think with the push from activists and civil society, but also sometimes parliamentarians and so on, we could come to something that could be
Yeah.
more rigid from that. But at the same time, I would also look at the UN treaty process as key to ensuring that businesses stop escaping
Okay.
accountability
So
around the.
you like the business and human rights, the treaty that's being drafted at the United Nations. You endorse that process. So you think it's going well.
Yeah, yes. I personally think it's a worthwhile process. I know that it's going to be very, very lengthy, and it's going to be very complicated, and it's going to take a lot of genuine efforts from states, especially in order for
Mm,
us to get to a point where we are, reaching a proper draft of the treaty. And I have been involved in the work, on behalf of Al-Haq surrounding the treaty, and I continue to be involved in it with ESCR-Net, but also with my current place of work. And we have pushed a lot for the inclusion of protections and rights and the framework generally of the international humanitarian law into the
right,
treaty, because we can't only talk about human rights law when we're discussing such a
right,
great and what should be a great and comprehensive
right,
a universal treaty. We can't just
right.
talk about human rights law when we know that businesses have in the past and continue to be involved in conflict areas, and they have in some instances fueled these conflicts and
Mm,
started them. And
mm,
there's a lot of examples not only in the Middle East but also from around the world that would speak about why we need to hold businesses accountable within the IHL framework as
mm,
well. And
mm,
that's something that I would also consider a success in, from the first draft of the treaty to where it is now, the additional focus that it has had on IHL and occupied territory specifically, although I know it's nowhere near being
yeah,
perfect or close to perfect at all, and so much needs to be done.
yes,
I completely understand, but when you look at the first draft and then
yeah.
like very little and undermining attention it gave to conflict areas and the IHL framework, I think now we're at a slightly better place that could take us somewhere further.
Maha, I am acutely aware now of the difficulties of interviewing someone about a topic that I also write and think and research about. Anyway, I'm biting my tongue. We have so much that we could and do chat about offline. Um, I share your hope for a business and human rights treaty that is robust and meaningful. I think I'm a
Mm.
little bit more skeptical of the process, but um, yeah, we'll see. I think let me put it a different way. I think your political science degree will come in handy during the drafting and in the application of any treaty too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I understand why you would be skeptical of the process. I have my own reservations as well. But it's inspiring. Sorry, again. It's inspiring to see during the negotiation sessions how much civil society is pouring in terms
Mm,
of efforts and resources
yeah,
into this treaty process, and
I agree. But are the
it's
businesses pouring
huge.
in? Are businesses
No,
pouring in
they're
a
not.
similar amount? Right. So
No, of course not.
I think,
But
yeah,
yeah, and I would see it as I mean, civil society is still powerful, and I would like to keep a positive and hopeful view that, united as civil society, like around the world, towards
mm.
one target, we will be able to achieve something. But again, I understand the reservations and the complications.
Let me segue to the award you received last year, speaking of the United Nations. So you were at the annual Forum for Business and Human Rights to accept on behalf of Al-Haq a Human Rights Award. Could you just tell us a little bit about that, which was really celebrating your great work?
Yes, I mean, I was there with the team, my colleagues from Al-Haq, and we were there, including our executive director when I was there at the time. And it was the award was granted on the basis of the organization's work on business and human rights. And the organization has been for more than a decade and a half now, I would say, like robustly focusing on issues surrounding corporate accountability, business and human rights in Palestine, but I feel like also the work has influenced a lot of other civil society in the region to also look at this framework and the available mechanisms, whether at a UN level or domestic levels, regional, and so on. So yeah, I mean, it was great to for the organization, for Al-Haq, to receive that as a Palestinian organization, as an Arab organization as well, that has been kind of in the lead in the region on these issues. So it is definitely it was definitely well deserved for the organization. Absolutely.
And your current role, you did leave Al-Haq earlier in 2020, and you've accepted a position now as International Advocacy Officer for the Cairo Institute for Human Rights. Your role, I understand it, will actually eventually be based, inshallah, in Brussels. But right now, because of COVID restrictions, you're in Jerusalem. Are you going to bring that business and human rights focus to your new role at the Cairo Institute as well?
Absolutely, and it's already work in progress. And I would like to also bring it in with a more regional focus, and especially now that I'm still working on human rights in Palestine, but I'm also looking at human rights in Syria and Yemen, and other colleagues in the Cairo Institute are also working on other country situations in the Arab world, Middle East region. So I feel like it could even be a stronger platform to advocate for business and human rights and corporate accountability, based on the case studies, based on what's happening in all of these different countries that we're covering. Absolutely.
Right. I believe there's been a submission to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, Office of the Prosecutor, to look at some company involvement in alleged war crimes, in particular arms suppliers in the Yemeni war. That's a rather grim remit you have, Maha. Palestine, Syria, Yemen. Um, Are there signs of hope in the Syria and the Yemeni contexts in terms of protecting human rights?
I mean, unfortunately, personally, I don't believe there are signs of hope for any genuine change or political change that will result in, better human rights and realizing human rights for Syria or Yemen. But again, I think a lot of people and a lot of colleagues from organizations that are based either in Syria or work on Syria and Yemen, whether there or in the diaspora, they also hang, to international law and look to it as a framework that could eventually achieve some sort of redress and justice for what's been happening, to better the situation in their home countries and so on. Obviously, I can't speak on behalf of Syrians and the Yemeni populations, but I like, given the growing number of human rights organizations and civil society actors from each context, I feel like there is a strong belief in the international human rights framework and the law and so on.
I'm constantly struck when I can't help but reflect, Maha, that you have such hope and you put such hope in international law and in human rights, and yet I can't think of harder, again, more wicked problems and areas to operate in. It's apart from the gardening, what gets you out of bed in the morning to go back and for more?
That's a good question. I personally wonder that myself sometimes, especially at times when I'm not so optimistic about the work or the framework that I'm operating in towards, realizing some change. But I think that it's a mix. It's a mix of being hopeful. It's a mix of seeing the good in people as well. I feel like, I mean, you can't divorce the law from the politics, from humans, from humanity. We're not machines that are behind desks, either as politicians or as human rights advocates or academics. We're also humans. And I think, as naive as that may sound, that kind of what drives me every, like especially in the times of, or the low times of my
Yeah.
life, that's for sure. But I mean, the situation is getting harder and harder, and not only here in Palestine, but I feel like regionally and globally. And sometimes it's really hard to see these rays of hope. But then, you know, when you think as the law or international law as a tool, and you think about and you look at initiatives that groups and people are taking in order to make the world better, whether it's, you know, on an environmental level or social and services level to marginalized people and groups, you know, you feel like these different tools should be able to meet at one point and create the change that many of us would want to see
Yeah.
in this world.
All right. Quick fire lightning round to wrap up, Maha. Heroes. I'm curious. Who are your human rights, your international law heroes?
And this is a question that I always think about and I'm very much asked about. And you know, I don't think I like to idealize persons, especially because, you know, in I, even if I have a favorite author or writer or practitioner, I don't know them enough. I don't know what they are like behind the papers or behind the lectures that they give and so
Oh.
on. But I can say,
Yeah.
but what I can say is that I've had a lot of people influence my career and influence my direction in life, not only career wise, but generally. And I owe it to them, definitely, like whether it's professors and lecturers from my university, like from my time at university at AUC or at the Irish Center specifically. I think that was also a major turning point for me in how I perceive the law and how I analyze and how I write and so on. And I'm forever grateful for that 1 year experience that, you know, still influences every day of my career. Also, you know, great influencers have been my colleagues at Al-Haq, those who mentored me and those who, you know, were so patient to get me to the level where I am today. But of course, I mean, it's one of the things that I always think about is that they also taught me that it's an ever ongoing learning process, and especially with the field that we deal with, because you need to always analyze and see it from different perspectives and so on.
Maha, I needed to explain the rules of a quick fire lightning round to you, Maha.
Oh, okay.
No,
Sorry.
no, appreciate the answer. Short
Yeah.
answers now. Quick fire.
Okay. Okay. I'll try.
No. So I'm not going to ask you to name names of people, but how about the best book you've ever read about human rights?
The best book I've read about human rights. They have been mostly academics, I would say. I would have to look at my library here.
Okay,
I'm terrible with the names.
we can come back
Mm,
to it.
yeah.
Favorite human
Yeah.
rights, or favorite international law movie?
Mm, really, Jonathan, I'm terrible with the names. That's the thing. Like I would watch and read something and completely forget the title.
But
So
Hollywood movie.
yeah. I know,
Oh,
I
okay.
know. I'm thinking about ones that I
You
have
forget
seen.
movie titles. We need to talk about that,
Yeah, I
Maha.
do. I do. Book titles, movie
Okay.
titles. Yeah.
This quickfire lightning round is going really well.
Yeah.
Um, okay. Well, how about your favorite international law moment in history?
Hmm.
You're a student of international law. I was just, is there a moment that strikes you as oh, that was cool?
I think the you know the beginnings of it and why it all started, and maybe it's not a favorite, but it always reminds me of why we have international law today. And it's important to remind others why we have international law today in the way that it is, to protect people, to not repeat the mistakes of the past again, to put this world, at a more equal
Mm,
basis than it was before.
mm.
Sorry, that wasn't quick enough.
And it wasn't a moment either. But anyway, here you go. This is absolutely quickfire. My penultimate question is a fill in the gap. International law is 3 words, please. Complete the sentence. International law is
3 words.
just a suggestion. It's not going to be
1
3
tool
words.
for justice, I would say. 4.
That's pretty good. Quick fire. All right, my final question, Maha. Thank you so much for your time. I'm wondering, there will be a lot of students of international law that view this and listen to it. So I'm curious, what advice would you have liked to have received when you were back in undergraduate BA in Cairo or over in Galway at the Irish Centre when you were a university student? What advice would you have liked to have received?
I think I would have liked to have a scoop into somebody's life doing the work that I'm doing now, because I wasn't at all sure what it was, where I would go, what would happen. So I think what you're doing now is great. And if I were your student, I would be very thankful for it.
Well, thank you, Maha, for sharing your story. And I think, yes, you're the one that has shared, and I think it's going to be invaluable, your story, to many people that do listen and watch this. So Maha Abdallah, thank you very much for this interview. Thank you. Good luck in your new role at the Cairo Institute, and hopefully you'll get to Brussels at some point, and hopefully we'll bump into one another again in Geneva at some time in the future. So thank you. Maha, thank you for advancing human rights, advancing Palestinian rights, pursuing justice, and making the world a better place.
Hopefully. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this.
Thanks, Maha.